Fantastic, thank you. Well, can I say, firstly, it's been a real joy to be here this week. It's been great to be able to get to know a few of you, engage with some of the questions that you've had. But really, what I'd love to say, and maybe you'd want to echo this too, is a huge well done to the Christian Union who've put on this whole week of events. They've worked their socks off, they've been baking cakes and printing flyers and handing them out and doing all sorts of stuff and giving their own money to make sure that this week could happen. And so before we do anything tonight, I thought it'd be great just to say a big thank you and well done to those guys that have worked really hard. So well done, guys. Well, tonight we're going to be thinking about this subject of hope, which is a massive subject. It was the 15th of January 1936, and a US submarine was patrolling the waters just off the US coast when it hit a Coast Guard vessel by accident. It rapidly sank to the ocean bed, and divers were sent to try and investigate whether there was anyone still alive within the wrecked submarine. And as they came near to the vessel, they heard the sound of tapping from within the shell of the submarine. And after a few seconds, they realized that the tapping was in fact Morse code. And the message that was being tapped out on the side of the submarine was this: "Is there any hope? Is there any hope? Is there any hope?" That's actually a good question to ask, isn't it? It's the kind of question we might ask when we look at our world and we see injustice and conflict and death and war. And we ask ourselves the question, is there any hope? Maybe it's the kind of question we ask when we look at our own lives. Maybe we look at our own failings when we're being more honest. Maybe we look at some of our broken relationships or our shattered dreams. And we ask the question, is there any hope? Is there any hope? And as we look at the reality of death, and we realize that actually ultimately that is the destination for all of humanity, the huge resounding question comes back, is there any hope? Is there any hope? You see, it may not be a fashionable thing to talk about death. In fact, death is like one of the last taboos in our society. It used to be that we didn't talk about sex in polite company. Oh, that's gone out the window. But nowadays, if you want to ruin a good party, you talk about death. I mean, you may be wondering why you've come to a Friday night talk thinking about the subject. It's a big taboo. We might joke about it. Woody Allen once famously said, "I'm not scared of dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens," which you might echo the sentiments of. But why is it that we have such an issue with the subject of death? Particularly when you consider that the statistics haven't changed. 1 out of 1 people still die. Well, perhaps it's because for all our advancements, for all our technology, for all our wealth, for all our increased knowledge, scientifically and in many other ways, even here in the West, we still have no answer to that big question of what happens next. I don't know whether you like the Harry Potter series of books, but J.K. Rowling was once interviewed about them, and she said this, very interestingly: "My books are largely about death. We're all frightened of it." And in her book, she explores the possibility of what might happen beyond death. And if you've read them, you'll know that at the end of the stories, she speculates with the idea that there may be something more. Possibly death isn't the end. But at best, it seems like a consolation prize, and not even certain at that. The artist Damien Hirst, in much of his works, explores the idea of death and what it means. And in an interview once, he said this: "Why do I feel so important when I'm not? Nothing is important and everything is important. I do not know why I'm here, but I'm glad that I am. I'd rather be here than not. I'm going to die and I want to live forever. I can't escape that fact. And I can't let go of the desire." Is there any hope? Is there anything beyond death? Or is that the end? And how would we ever know? That's the question. Of course, people down through the ages have speculated and considered what might happen. But the problem when it comes to this big subject is that all of us are rather unqualified. All of us stand on this side of death, speculating about what might lie beyond. But none of us can speak with certainty about it. I'll give you an illustration. A few years ago, I was in Cape Town, South Africa, and I travelled down to this place, Cape Point, right at the southwestern tip of the African continent. And until about 500 years ago, no one from Europe had ever successfully navigated by boats down the west coast of Africa and beyond this point. This point where two oceans meet and jagged rocks stick out into the oceans was a treacherous place to go as a sailor. And although many had tried, all of them had been shipwrecked on the rocks, and many of them had lost their lives. And so this place had been known as the Cape of Storms, a place of the unknown and a place of fear. And then a Portuguese sailor called Vasco da Gama set off from Portugal down the west coast of Africa, but unlike his predecessors, he made it beyond this point, all the way to India, in fact, and then back. And as a result of his successful exploration, they changed the name of this place from what it was, the Cape of Storms, to what it's now more popularly known as, the Cape of Good Hope. And actually, that's a great illustration of what the Christian faith claims about Jesus Christ. See, the Christian faith claims that in the person of Jesus Christ, there is one person in history who has conquered death, who, as it were, sailed past it and come back to tell the tale. That in the person of Jesus Christ, we have one person in all of history that is uniquely qualified to speak about life, death, and eternity. Because he is the one who himself has come back from the grave. Now, of course, having mentioned that, you might be here thinking, how could I believe that? So what we're going to do tonight is, first of all, look at some of the evidence for this outrageously big and yet foundational claim to the Christian faith, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, before we think a little bit more about the implications of it. So to help us do that, I'm going to invite Lindsay, who's no stranger to it by now, because Lindsay's been speaking through the week, to spend a few moments exploring some of the evidence for the resurrection. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you. In the last century, there was a famous thinker called C.E.M. Joad. He was a humanist, he wasn't a Christian, and he said this: if I had the opportunity to speak to any one historical figure, who would it be? I would choose to speak to Jesus Christ. And if I could ask him one question, I'd ask him the most important question in the history of the world. Did you or did you not rise from the dead? He went on to say, it's either the supreme fact in history or it is a gigantic hoax. Now, there are four ways in which you can try to discern truth. One is through scientific research. A second is through intuition. People say it felt right to me. It's not a very strong argument, but it's how a lot of people live. The third is to look at historical evidence, and we've done that early this week, looking at the claims of Jesus Christ. The fourth is to use arguments as in a legal court. Now, the interesting thing is, as you look at the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, in 2,000 years, there has never been one book ever by a lawyer claiming that he's got a watertight alternative explanation to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Not one. Many books have been written by lawyers who set out to disprove the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Many of them became followers themselves because of the weight of the evidence. One such person was Professor Sir Norman Anderson, Cambridge University, who said that he was professor of law in Cambridge, and he said, I've often secured convictions in the law court on much flimsier evidence than this. So let's look at the main options in terms of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, in the last 200 years, people realizing the centrality of the resurrection of Christ, that if it happened, it's a game changer, they've tried to find alternative explanations for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There are really only 6 options that people have come up with, 5 of them just in the last 200 years. Before that, there was only one alternative to Jesus rising from the dead. Let's look at each one of them. We'll list here all 6, I think, on this page. Option number 1, Jesus didn't die but swooned and revived in the cool of the tomb. Option number 2, the disciples stole the body. Option number 3, the religious leaders stole the body. Option number 4, the women went to the wrong tomb. Only men say that one. Option number 5, the disciples were hallucinating. Option number 6, Jesus rose from the dead. Now, as we go through, ask yourself which you find most convincing of these, and see if you can come up with a solid alternative explanation for the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Let's go through them quickly, one by one. Firstly, the argument that Jesus didn't die but fainted and revived in the cool of the tomb. This was never argued for the first 1800 years after the writing of the New Testament. It was an idea mooted by an Italian guy called Venturini around about the year 1800. The problem with it is that it ignores the deadly character of Jesus' wounds. If you read the New Testament accounts, his side was pierced by a spear, and blood and water came out separately. Also, there were holes in his hands and feet. Then he was placed in a sealed tomb for 3 days. Without any human help, he managed somehow to roll away a sealed tomb and walk several miles to a place called Emmaus without any obvious discomfort. During that time, his tomb was guarded by Roman soldiers, 8 to 12 of them probably, who were at pain of death if the body had been stolen. But what is interesting is that in the 1800s, medical doctors and researchers discovered that one of the first signs of death is the separation of blood and water into clot and serum. This wasn't known in the first century when the biographical accounts of Jesus were written, especially the one by John, who had lived with Jesus for 3 years. When he saw Jesus on the cross with his side pierced, he saw blood and water came out separately. He recorded this, not knowing that it is a sign of death. And then we have to ask ourselves, how did he escape without any obvious discomfort? If you take this little booklet, which is the Gospel of Luke, you can read this incident for yourself at the end of the booklet. You can take this home with you if you wish. It's page 162. Just at the bottom of the page, you can see Jesus appears to his disciples. 162 stands amongst them. And right at the bottom, verse 37, it says, they were startled and frightened, thinking they'd seen a ghost. He said, why are you troubled? Why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. They still didn't believe it because of joy and amazement. He asked them, do you have anything here to eat? And on the next page, it says, they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. So he was a living human being standing before them. Second argument that people sometimes use, and this was the only one used for 1800 years, it's the one used by people in the first century, that the disciples stole the body. This is the idea that the religious leaders put around, Jewish religious leaders, who wanted to destroy the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. The problem is it goes against Jesus' moral teaching. He had told the disciples not to lie. So then to go ahead and lie about such an event and say he rose again from the dead when they knew he hadn't would really be an abrogation of what Jesus had taught his closest followers. Secondly, they were in despair. They didn't want to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. And thirdly, we have to ask then, why did most of them die martyrs' deaths within 60 years of Jesus' supposed resurrection? I suppose if I were to ask, would you be prepared to die for something you believe is the truth? Some people might say yes. Not many would these days. Not many believe anything is worth dying for. But if I asked you a second question, would you die for something you know is a lie? No one is foolish enough to do that. Why then, if the disciples stole the body, were they prepared to die martyrs' deaths, claiming that they'd met the risen Jesus? Doesn't make sense. Third option is that the religious leaders stole the body. This was not reported. This idea didn't come up for 1800 years either, but there's no motive because for the previous 3 years they'd been wanting to execute Jesus. So finally having him executed, they wouldn't have hidden the body away surely because they didn't want the people to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, which he claimed, and that he'd risen from the dead. There's no motive. Fourth option. The women went to the wrong tomb. This is a painting in the last 100 years of how one painter imagined the women going to the tomb. Let's look at the next page. This notion has only come up really in the last 60 years. And it was invented by a group of men who said the women were just emotional when Jesus died. They went to the tomb. They got overexcited, particularly Mary, when she saw a gardener. And she confused him for Jesus and went then running around saying Jesus had risen from the dead. The problem is, rabbinic teaching said that in the first century that you couldn't believe the testimony of a woman unless it was corroborated by several men. So it seems remarkable that Jesus revealed himself first of all to a woman. Actually, in doing so, it gives great dignity to all women, because Jesus was, the women were there at the cross, and they were there at the day of the resurrection. And it shows that Jesus was treating women with as much dignity as he treats all men. The other thing, of course, is that there are 11 other recorded appearances. The appearance to the women wasn't the only one. If you turn to this biographical account again, by Luke, who was a doctor, remember, in recording this, and we can see briefly his record of the women, Jesus appearing to the women in chapter 24, page 158, which you may want to read later on when you go home. If you want to check out on the evidence, it says, halfway down the page, chapter 24, the women took spices they prepared and went to the tomb. Verse 4, while they were wondering about this, 2 men appeared and stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. And they said that Jesus was not there, he had risen. Right at the bottom of the page, when they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. Now, the men who perpetrated this idea generally say it was only Mary who went to the tomb and she was confused. But the text actually says it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, that's 3 women, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. So it was a whole group of women. Subsequently, the apostles went to check it out themselves and saw that the tomb was empty. And of course, there were a further 10 appearances recorded, including one where Jesus appeared to 500 people in one go. Let's look at the next page. Quotation from Professor John Polkinghorne, who I think is the recently retired professor of physics in Cambridge University, Christian himself. And he said this: perhaps the strongest reason of taking the stories of the empty tomb absolutely seriously lies in the fact that it is women who play the leading role. It would have been very unlikely for anyone in the ancient world who was concocting a story to assign the principal part to women, since in those times they were not considered capable of being reliable witnesses in a court of law. Now let's look at the next one, the fifth, the penultimate. That's a painting by Rembrandt, imagining Mary seeing Jesus at the tomb, at first confused, thinking he was a gardener. That's in the Queen's collection. If you can get a close-up of it, it's a remarkable painting of Mary's face, because you see this mixture of amazement, wonder, and joy as it suddenly dawns upon her that it's Jesus she's seeing, not the gardener. But of course, the biblical text says there were several women there, not just Mary. The fifth option, which again has only come up in the 20th century, never recorded before then, and this is the argument of some who say the disciples were hallucinating. Well, I went to check this one out last week, and I went to speak to the professor of psychiatry in Bristol University, Professor Glyn Harrison. And I asked him, on the evidence that you see about the apparent resurrection of Jesus, do you think you could argue, from a psychiatric point of view, that the disciples were hallucinating? And he said, definitely not. And these are the reasons he gives, just fresh from this professor. Hallucinations normally occur to individuals, not to large groups. Secondly, they're usually associated with wish fulfillment, but these early disciples didn't want to believe. Thirdly, they tend to be over a long period. These stopped suddenly after 6 weeks when Jesus ascended into heaven. And normally they're in limited, specific places, but Jesus' 12 appearances actually occurred in many different places and in different light. In upper rooms by the side of the Sea of Galilee, on a mountaintop before 500, in the open before others. He said it doesn't fit with the way that hallucinations tend to occur. Those are the only 5 alternative explanations that people have been able to dream up over about 2,000 years to try to explain away the resurrection of Jesus. The sixth and the last option is that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's what you need to reflect on this evening. Which of those options you're going to run with. It is so pivotal in the history of the world, you really owe it to yourself to do the research to come up with a satisfactory alternative explanation for the apparent resurrection of Jesus. If you can discern that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, you might as well close all churches and turn them into antique centers or bingo halls. However, if you see that the weight of the evidence, like Professor Sir Norman Anderson and others, is seen to be in favor of the resurrection of Jesus, the only option is to bow down and worship him.
Well, fantastic. That's one skeptic who looked at the evidence and found it compelling. Well, maybe you're saying tonight, well, I'm a skeptic. I still can't be convinced by that. Because maybe you're saying, well, look, I'm a 21st century thinking person that just finds this too big a too big a thing to really believe. Given our presuppositions, the idea of resurrection seems ridiculous, doesn't it? No matter how much evidence we have. But it's worth saying, just before we move on, that for the first followers of Jesus Christ, for them to come to the conclusion that God had come into the world in the person of Jesus, died on a cross and risen again 3 days later, was no more part of their expectations than it is part of ours. They weren't expecting it to be true. They didn't expect it to happen. And they weren't immediately convinced without good evidence that it had happened. You see, think about it. These guys had all the good reasons for thinking that this wasn't going to take place. And we've got good clues to show that that's the case. Throughout Jesus' life, Jesus had said on many occasions that he was going to die and that 3 days later he would rise again. And yet at the end of the gospel accounts, when Jesus does go to Jerusalem and die, what do we find 3 days later? Well, Lindsay explained it to us. We find women going to a tomb to anoint a dead body. Now, why aren't they expecting the resurrection to happen? Because even though Jesus had said that it was going to happen, they still couldn't get it into their heads because it wasn't part of their expectation. And when they first saw the risen Jesus, they didn't immediately assume that he'd risen from the dead, but at first they thought it was a ghost until they were convinced otherwise. Because they didn't believe it simply because it was easy, or because it naturally fitted with their expectations and their worldview. They believed it because they found compelling reasons to think that it was true. And they were willing to change their presuppositions about what's possible in the light of the evidence about what actually happened. My question to you is, are you willing to do the same? Well, listen, if this did happen, what difference does it make? Well, as we start to draw towards the end, let's think about just some of the implications that this might have, because there are many events in history, but not all of them have implications today, which is why we're thinking about this claim tonight. If the resurrection of Jesus Christ happened, what difference does it make? Let me give you 4 implications. Firstly, it means the future is certain. In the New Testament, we have a record of a man called Paul, who was a Christian preacher who spoke in the city of Athens to a group of philosophers. And at the end of his address, he says this. He says, God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he's appointed. And he's given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Paul's point is that one day there is going to be a day of judgment, and the one who is going to be doing the judging is none less than the person who rose from the dead, Jesus Christ. That the man who rose from the dead in history is the man who all history is going to stand before one day in the future. And if that is true, that's worth thinking through, isn't it? I mean, if Jesus Christ is the one who we're going to stand before, it would be worth thinking through rather than trying to suppress it and put it to the back of our minds. Try and give you an illustration of this. I remember I was driving from my house in Bournemouth once up to Suffolk to go and speak at a church, actually. And I was on the way, going up the A14, trying to be a good law-abiding citizen and keeping to the speed limits. And I was doing, I think, 69.5 miles an hour down this dual carriageway. And I came around the corner, under a bridge, and I saw at the side of the road a policeman pointing a gun, a speed gun, at me. And I looked at my speedo and I saw that I was doing just under 70, so I thought I was fine until I looked to the side of the policeman and I saw a big red circle with the numbers 50 in the middle of it. And then I realised I was in trouble. But of course, by the time I'd thought about all of this, I was now several hundred yards past the police car. And I looked in my rear view mirror and I saw that the policeman was getting into the police car, turning on the blue flashing lights and pulling out into the road behind me. But of course, by this point, I was a good deal further down the road. Now, I have to confess what the first thought was that came into my mind. And bearing in mind I'm going to speak at the church, maybe this isn't what I should confess. But the first thing that came into my mind was, if you floor it, you can beat him. Didn't stay there for very long, but it did cross my mind. I mean, I thought, well, my car's not that slow. I could, his is probably not that fast. And then I suddenly started to reason with myself. Look, he's already got your registration plate. So even if he doesn't catch up with you sooner, it will be later. It would be better to face up to the implications now rather than put it off and hope for the best. Now, that might be a silly illustration, but the reality is this. If Jesus Christ is the judge who one day history will stand before, wouldn't it be better to stop and think about what the implications might be now, rather than suppressing that thought and hoping for the best that it might go away? It'd be worth considering it seriously, wouldn't it? But here's the second implication of the resurrection. Not only is the future certain, but secondly, the past can be forgiven. At lunchtime today, we looked at the claim that in Jesus' death, there is the possibility of forgiveness for anyone who's willing to receive it. That Jesus' death isn't a tolerance for our sins, but a forgiveness for our sins. That God is able to say that all of the payment and the justice that we deserve and we should make for our sin was made by Jesus. That all of our past, whatever it's been like, can be wiped clean. And that we can have a fresh start and a new beginning. But of course, how do we know that Jesus' death on the cross really was what is really necessary to connect us again to God? How do we know that Jesus' death on the cross really can give us forgiveness? Well, his death alone would give us no assurance. It may have just been a sad accident. But the New Testament says repeatedly it's the resurrection that is the vindication of his claims. In many ways, it's the proof that the payment of his death had been accepted by God the Father. It's a bit like when you go into a shop and you pay with a credit card. Maybe it never happens to you, but sometimes it happens to me. I'm a little bit worried whether I've got enough credit in my credit card to actually pay what I'm paying for. And it's only when the receipt rolls and they give me the receipt that I know that the payment's been accepted. And the resurrection is like the receipt that shows the payment of the cross has been accepted. And that through Jesus' death, it really is possible to be connected again to God. Now, why is that important? I think deep down in some of our lives, one of the reasons why we try and suppress the thoughts about God and the thoughts about Jesus may well be that because we think to ourselves, if this is true, and Jesus Christ really did rise from the dead, then I'm in trouble. Because many of us have spent our lives ignoring him. And many of us have spent our lives doing things that we know actually would probably grieve him and hurt him. And what hope is there for us if Jesus Christ is the judge one day? Well, the great news is that there is every hope for us. Because this Jesus also died to forgive us and give us a fresh start. Isn't that incredible? Against all the odds, we can spend our lives saying to God, I don't care about you, and yet he cares about us. We can say to God throughout our lives, keep out of my life, and yet he's willing to do all of that for us. So that relationship with him that's been broken and damaged can be restored and made new. The past, with the big and the small stuff, can be wiped clean. And I can have a fresh start with the God of the universe. And it's the resurrection that gives me the assurance that knows that can be true. That's the second implication. The past can be forgiven. Here's a third one. Today matters. You see, if death is the end, what is the point of life? Last night we looked at some of the existentialist philosophers who had taken this to its logical extreme. People who thought about what life would be like if ultimately this life is all there is. And we looked at how ultimately that means that life is futile. Because no matter what I achieve or what I do, or even what I contribute to society, at the end of the day, nothing really matters. And everything is permissible. No matter what I do, at the end of the day, nothing will really last. But actually, if the resurrection of Jesus Christ is true, then today does matter. Because the Christian hope is not simply that we'll escape this world one day and go off to heaven as if we would detach from this world and didn't care about it. But the Christian hope is that one day God is going to restore this world and transform it. He's going to sort out the mess and put it right. He's going to put things the way they should be. And the Christian hope is that this life is not all there is. That one day this world is going to be transformed. And that if we know and trust in Jesus Christ, that we can be part of that future hope that will go on beyond the grave. And I want to suggest that makes a really big difference to life now. See, Christians who have this hope don't detach themselves from life in the vain hope that one day they will escape it, but they should throw themselves into life with the real hope that it all counts. You see, Christians aren't just concerned about going to church and singing songs. A Christian who has the hope of the resurrection is someone who should embrace all of life with renewed joy and enthusiasm and energy, because we know that it really does matter. It's not just going to be wiped away one day. It's not just going to be a footnote in history that's going to be destroyed. What we do in life really counts. And everything counts. Your studies matter. Your relationships matter. Your arts and hobbies matter. Everything matters. The environment. If Jesus Christ is going to restore this creation, then what happens in life now really matters, because it isn't all going to end. It's going to be transformed. And that makes a difference today. The future is certain. The past can be forgiven. Today matters. And fourthly, there is hope. There is hope. The Christian hope, as we've said, is not some fairy tale, not pie in the sky or fluffy cotton wool, but the Christian hope is a real physical hope, because it's based on the fact that Jesus physically rose from the dead. And actually that is different from any other philosophy, any other religious claim in the world. The Christian hope is that it's this physical world and these physical bodies that can be transformed. And that can give real hope to people who are hurting. Real hope. Joni Eareckson Tada was an athletic teenage girl who on a summer's afternoon dived into a lake that was too shallow, hit her neck and head on the bottom of that lake, and has spent the rest of her life as a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the neck down. And yet she said this about her hope in Christ: "I can scarcely believe it. I, with shriveled bent fingers, atrophied muscles, and no feeling from the shoulders down, will one day have a new body, light, bright, and clothed in righteousness, powerful and dazzling." Can you imagine this hope this gives someone spinal cord injured like me? Or someone who is cerebral palsied or brain injured? Imagine the hope this gives someone who is manic depressive. No other religion, no other philosophy promises new bodies, hearts, and minds. Only in the gospel of Christ do hurting people find such incredible hope. That is the hope of the resurrection. A real hope for real people with real hurts. And you see, the Christian hope isn't simply that there's going to be a kind of consolation prize. I think it's interesting that in the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling speculates about the possibility of life beyond death. But actually, the real deal is here and now. But compare that with the Christian worldview represented in the stories of C.S. Lewis. Lewis in the Narnia Chronicles was in some ways analogizing the Christian life. And in the last book, one of my favorites, The Last Battle, he starts to consider what this Christian hope is like. And he finishes his stories not by bringing his characters back from the brink of death to live life here in this world now. For he considers that life now is ultimately really the Shadowlands in comparison with what is to come. Just listen to what's the last page. Sorry if I'm going to ruin the end of the series, but hey, it's not really going to ruin it too much. It's still worth reading. That says this: Aslan, the lion, the figure of Christ in many ways in the stories, says to the children at the end who are confused about where they are. He says, "There was a real railway accident," said Aslan softly. "Your father and mother and all of you are, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead. The term is over. The holidays have become. The dream is ended. This is the morning." And as he spoke, he no longer looked at them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can most truly say they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, and in which every chapter is better than the one before. See, for Lewis, life now is the Shadowlands. And because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the holidays are yet to come. The real story is yet to begin. And we can look forward to that. You may say, well, is that just a story? Is that too good to be true? Well, actually, I want to suggest it's not too good to be true. But it's so good because it is true. That's what we've looked at tonight. The Christian faith isn't based on a nice illusion or a pipe dream or a fairy tale. It's based on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. It's true and it's wonderful. And can I say it makes all the difference in the world? Because in the realities of life and death, it is the message of Jesus and the resurrection that makes the biggest difference of all. I grew up in Leicester, not far from here, just a bit further south down the M1. And when I was growing up, just before I went away to college in Edinburgh, I got to know a family, a couple called Barry and Paula and their kids. And they lived just outside Leicester in one of the villages in North Leicestershire. And when I went away to college, I got an email a few weeks into term telling me the tragic news that Paula, who was then in her late 30s, had been diagnosed with cancer. She was taken for treatments, and after several courses of chemotherapy, the doctors eventually said that there was going to be no hope, that there was nothing else they could do. They gave her several weeks to live. She didn't live as long as they expected. And after a while, she died. And a week later, they had the funeral service in a little village chapel where they used to go, just outside Leicester. And at the funeral service, it was packed. There were people there, her family, her friends, and others crammed into this little chapel. And as they brought in the coffin to the church for the start of the service, they played a song over the loudspeakers, a song that was actually familiar to many of the people there. But everybody sat up and listened. Because the song that was being played was being sung by Paula, the lady who was now in the coffin. And she'd actually sung it just 2 weeks before, knowing that she was about to die, with the specific request that it be played at her funeral service. And the last verse of that song contains these words: "No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand, till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand." See, this is real, and it makes a real difference to those who come to know it for themselves. It means there's forgiveness for the past, the reality of significance and meaning to life now in the present, and hope in the future. It isn't a pipe dream, but it's a reality. And my question to you would be, do you know that forgiveness? Do you know that hope? And do you know the significance and the transformation that Jesus Christ can bring into your lives right now? Have you come to experience that? Well, in 2 minutes' time, I'm going to explain, for those who are interested, how you could do that and what that would mean, just very briefly before we wrap up. But before that, I'm just going to invite Michael and Ella to come back up and just play an instrumental song, just not so we can kind of carry on talking and go and get more cakes, but just so we can sit quietly and reflect on what we've heard. Not just tonight, but also through this week. For many of us have heard a number of things this week. And before we rush into the busyness of conversations and heading home, it would be good to pause and take a moment to consider what we've heard and to think about what our reaction and response to it might be. Do we know the reality of that in our lives? And if not, what's stopping you from coming to know that for yourself? So just take this moment just to reflect, to think, and then I'll wrap up in just a moment's time. In the New Testament, in the last book of the Bible, in fact, in Revelation, there's a verse that gives us a kind of visual picture of the risen Jesus that we've heard about tonight. And in the verse it says simply this. It's Jesus speaking. He says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice, I will come in and eat with them and they with me." Jesus speaking. He talks about the door, not the doorway of a physical house, but the doorway of our lives. And he says, actually, I'm asking to be invited in, but he's not going to barge his way in. He's there, but we need to invite him in. Holman Hunt was an artist in the 1800s who painted a picture to visualize this idea called Jesus as light of the world. And it's interesting because Jesus is knocking at the door, but if you look carefully at the door, there's no handle on the outside. The handle's on the inside. Because actually it's the choice of the person on the inside as to whether they respond to that invitation. Jesus knocks and says, I want to be invited in, but will we invite him in? To forgive us, to clean out the rubbish, to come on board and to live with us, to eat with us, that picture of fellowship and relationship and friendship. And as we've heard about tonight, to give us that certainty of hope in the future. Have we ever opened the door, as it were, and invited Jesus Christ in to our lives? Have we allowed him in to the hearts of each one of us? Well, I guess you may be thinking about whether you've done that before. Maybe you haven't done that before. And my question tonight would be, why not? What's stopping you from doing that? And maybe some people are sitting here and you're saying, well, actually, the thing that's stopping me from doing that is I'm just not sure yet. I'm not 100% certain. Maybe you've been thinking about these things over the course of the week and hearing more answers to your questions, but maybe there's still questions and doubts that you have. Can I say that's fine? But also, can I also say that you don't have to wait until all your doubts are dealt with and all your questions are answered until you can put your trust in Jesus Christ. That's not to say that faith in Christ is irrational, but it is to say that actually in life, most of the decisions we make when we haven't yet received 100% certainty. For actually 100% certainty is something that you rarely come by. But you actually base it on the basis of the evidence that you have available and the most reasonable choice that you've got. Can I suggest that for some people here, actually, as you've uncovered more about the claims of Jesus this week, it would be a bigger leap of faith for some of you to reject this now, given what you now know, than it would be to accept it. It would be harder, actually, to say this is all a load of rubbish and disregard it, because you know it's not. And you can be honest with your doubts as well. There was a guy in the Bible who came to Jesus, and Jesus said, "Do you believe?" And this guy said to Jesus, "I believe, help my unbelief." Now, Jesus didn't say to him, "Go away and come back when you're more certain." He said, "That's enough to get started." So you can be absolutely honest about your doubts, and that's fine. Jesus will take us just as we are. Maybe you're saying, well, look, I've got more questions. And as you've hopefully seen this week, Christianity does welcome your questions and isn't afraid of honest and humble questions. We don't have exhaustive answers to everything we might like to know, but we do have sufficient answers, giving us everything we need to know to make a reasoned choice. And being a Christian is about continually asking more questions. And hopefully, as you ask those questions, finding good answers and growing in your confidence. But you don't have to wait again until all those questions have been answered. Why not invite Jesus into your life and ask him to help you with the remaining questions that you've got? He wants to, and he will. Maybe you're here and you're saying, actually, my problem is I just don't feel it. You know, I've heard about it, I understand it's up here, it kind of makes sense, but I need to feel something before I do something about it. Well, I guess one thing I would say is be very wary of basing any big decisions on life simply on your feelings. For feelings are very irrational and often erratic things, aren't they? My feelings go up and down depending on the rugby scores and the curry that I had the night before, which isn't always a very good foundation for building life-changing decisions. Our feelings are unstable, but the facts are unchanging. And the Christian faith is based upon the facts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and an act of our will in response to that, not an act of our emotions and how we feel about it. And also, can I say this? Imagine I was to say to you, you know what? I'm going to get married when I feel married. You would say, don't be so stupid. You'll be waiting forever. You're going to feel married if you ever get round to getting married. The feelings come after the decision that's made. And in the same way, if we want to know the presence of God in our lives, the joy of forgiveness and the hope that he brings, that won't come until we invite him to come in and give it to us. But if we make the step and act of our will in trusting Jesus Christ, then he promises that the feelings will follow. They're not unimportant, but they're not all important. And they're certainly not the foundation on which we build. Or maybe some of you are thinking, well, what would others people think? If I was to join the Jesus crew, and start following Jesus Christ, what are other people going to say? Well, I guess some of us in different situations. I think to some of the blokes here, I just want to say, don't be a wuss and man up. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? We can have all the bravado, but be kind of scared about what people might think about us. If this is true, if Jesus Christ rose from the dead, then make that stand. Whatever people think. Actually, maybe there are some of you, and actually for you, that's much more serious. For like a friend of mine, when he became a Christian, the result was that his family disowned him, and actually some of them tried to kill him. Now, why would anyone make a decision to follow Jesus Christ in the light of such consequences? Well, I once asked him, I said, why on earth did you do it? And how on earth can you carry on as a Christian given the opposition that you faced? And he said, because I'm convinced it's true. And secondly, because what I've discovered in following Jesus Christ and the blessings and benefits of that outweigh even the great costs that I've had to face in coming to that decision. See, for some it is going to be hard to follow Jesus Christ. Actually, for the majority of people in the world, it involves great costs, socially and in other ways. But if it's true, then it's worth going where the evidence leads. And Jesus Christ says he's no man's debtor. If we follow him, ultimately, that is the wise choice to make. And the cost of not following him would be greater than the cost of following him. I guess maybe one final thing you might be thinking is, well, look, I like all this, but I look at the lives of my Christian friends and I think I could never live like them. I could never keep it up. I could never live the Christian life. And you know what? You can't. And neither could they on their own. But living the Christian life isn't about trying hard, but it's about trusting in Jesus Christ. Trusting in him not just to forgive us for the past, to wipe the slate clean, but trusting in him to come into our lives and give us the power to be different in the future. And he will. Just as that verse says, he'll come into our lives and start to change them for the better. Not taking away our personality and making us like clones, but enhancing our true personality and making us into the people he wants us to be. And he knocks at the door of your hearts and he asks you whether you'd want to let him in. And I'd want to ask you that question. What's stopping you? And actually, if there's no good reason, then why not? Given what we've heard this week about the truth, the wonder, and the goodness of the Christian faith, I would suggest the most reasonable thing to do is to respond to that invitation and to ask him to do just what we've heard tonight. So what I'd love to do is just to wrap up now with a short prayer. This may not be for everyone. Some of you may have already made that decision, and for others maybe, yes, you are still skeptical and not ready to do it. But I think for some, maybe for many tonight, you're ready to do something about it. Even though you don't have all your questions sorted and you may still have doubts, you're ready at least to get started and say to God, if this is true and real, I would like to know you and I want to get going with you. And so if you would like to do that, then as I pray, it's not a magic formula, by the way, it's just words, but it's words that might help echo the sentiment of your hearts as a way of speaking to God, for that's what prayer is, and starting that relationship. Because relationships start with words normally, don't they? Not always the most confident words and often quite stumbling and nervous words, but they start with words. Maybe these words would help you. So let me pray. And if you'd like to as well, then why not join me? Just silently in your hearts. God, I do think that these things might be true. I've still got many questions and doubts. But as far as I know how, I want to trust in Jesus Christ now. I invite him into my life. Please clean out the rubbish. Please take control. Please give me this certain hope. Amen. Amen.